Veterans Affairs Finance Policy Division to order. First up, we'll start off with the pledge. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Brand, have you had a chance to look at the minutes?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I move the minutes from March 26th.
Is there any errors or omissions? Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All say nay. Motion carries. All right, first up, only thing up today is, I'll start off. The chair moves House File 2086 before the committee. And with that, I will ask, or I'm going to move the DE3 amendment that you have in your packet. Any questions on the DE3 amendment? Okay, all right. So we'll move the DE3 amendment. First off, before I call on Ms. Roberts to go through the spreadsheet and all that stuff, I want to thank the committee for all the work that you did, showing up diligently for committee meetings. I appreciate that. Staff, our nonpartisan staff, Ms. Roberts, Mr. Deeble, thank you for keeping us in line, keeping us straight. And for our partisan researchers, John and Sean, thank you for all the work you've done. And then Owen and this young man here, Josh, I couldn't have done any of this stuff without these guys keeping me straight. And Representative Detmer, thank you for your advice the whole way through.
And yes, Mr. Chair, and I think this is probably the best committee to be on in the Capitol here, and the staff that we have working for us, and also being able to work together in a bipartisan way or nonpartisan way, and on all the things that are important for our veterans and our military affairs. But thank you for your leadership and your staff and the rest of the people that are on the committee. It's a great committee to be working on. Thank you.
And the pages. I had to have a note to remind me to thank the pages. Sorry, folks. You're the one to make sure everything's here for us, so we really do appreciate that. So thank you for your work, too. So thanks, John. All right, Ms. Roberts, we have the spreadsheet in our packet. Ms. Roberts is going to walk us through that, and then we'll move on to the bill itself.
Mr. Chair, members, I'm going to walk through the first page of the spreadsheet, which is labeled change items only, and you're going to want to look at the columns that are about in the middle of the page. It's labeled House File 2086 DE Amendment. The first change items, first we'll look at Department of Military Affairs. The first on line 6 is sustain the state enlistment and retention bonus programs, and the amendment includes $1.75 million for that item. The second item is the reintegration program for deployed service members, and the amendment includes $116,000 for the biennium for that change item. So the total change items for Department of Military Affairs are $1.866 million. And then that brings the total recommended spending on line 14 for the Department of Military Affairs to $48.1 million for the biennium. And the second department is the Department of Military Affairs, and starting on line 18, you can see the various changes. The first is the Program and Services Operating Adjustment for $544,000 for the biennium. The second is the State Veteran Cemeteries Operating Adjustment for $775,000 for the biennium. For the Minnesota Service Corps expansion, this is an increase to that activity of $500,000 for the biennium. On line 23, you'll see there was a recommendation from the governor for a reduction in the funding to the Veterans Homes for a Medical Services Provider realignment, and the DE amendment does not include that adjustment. The next three items are bills that were recently heard by the division. The first is the Armed Forces Service Center grant. It's $100,000 in one-time funding. The second is the Veterans Justice Grant, House File 430, and that's $200,000 each year for a total of $400,000. And finally, the Medal of Honor Memorial, $150,000 in one-time funding. So the total increase for the Department of Veterans Affairs is $2.5 million for the biennium. And that brings their total funding for Veterans Affairs to $161 million for the biennium. And at the bottom of the sheet, you can see then on line, I think it's 37, the total recommended increase included in the amendment is $4.335 million for the biennium for the two departments. And then the following pages on the spreadsheet are really just a more detailed look showing the breakdown by program and budget activity, and then the change items are included in this. I'm not going to walk through this line by line, but certainly if members have any questions on it, I'm available to answer those. For example, you'll see more of the detail under the Veterans Programs and Services and what's funded through the department. So if there's any questions on the spreadsheet.
Thank you, Ms. Roberts. Any questions for Ms. Roberts on the spreadsheet? Thank you. Mr. Debo, we'll move to the bill.
Mr. Chair and members, I'll walk through the short Article 2 policy section and identify which bills have been included in the DE3. Starting on page 7, section 1 of Article 2, that's the Chair's House File 1958, which is a bill from the agency regarding publicity representative authorization for the Department of Veterans Affairs. Turning to page 8, on section 2 at the top of the page, this is Chair Ecklund's House File 1959, which is another agency proposal regarding their authority to implement their statutes, chapters 197 and 198. Moving to page 9, section 3. This is a piece of Representative O'Neill's homestead tax eligibility data bill, House File 203. Section 4 on page 9 is Representative Zhang's House File 889, related to the definition of veterans for GI benefits. Moving to page 10, section 5 on page 10, line point 24. This is part 2 of Representative O'Neill's House File 204. Moving to page 11, section 6. This is the Chair's House File 998 regarding military veteran offenders restorative justice sentencing language. And that concludes the overview of Article 2 of the DE amendment, Mr. Chair.
Any questions for Mr. Debo? It's going pretty good. So I have a couple comments before we open it up to public testimony. The governor had a $3.3 million above base target, and leadership gave us an extra $1 million, so we kind of moved some of the money around to try to make some things work that we wanted to. I know there's not everybody's all happy about how this went, but that's how we put the bill together. So now we'll open it up to public testimony. Oh, I apologize. We got 2 amendments. So we will take, and these are both mainly just technical amendments. So just so you know, Owen had this in perfect order before I got here, and I screwed it up, but they're both here now. So anyway. Okay, so the A3 amendment has to deal with the Veterans Restorative Justice Grant, and the Commissioner may use up to 7% of this appropriation each year for costs incurred to administer the program under this section. So I'll move the A3 amendment. Any discussion? All in favor of the A3 say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say nay. Motion carries. Thank you. Then the A4 amendment.
Chair, that's my amendment.
Yeah, Representative Detmer, would you like to move the A4 amendment? Thank you.
Like move A4 amendment. Like if you turn to page 5, line 5. After the training, after the word training, insert and services. And then on page 5, line 6, insert a county or city may apply for a Veterans Justice Grant to establish or operate a Veterans Pretrial Diversion Program for eligible offenders. What we're doing here, we're making it more accessible by other veterans groups. In this case, the county veteran service officers.
And the members, Representative Detmer and I have talked about this amendment. I'm okay with that. So any questions for the amendment author? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say nay. Motion carries. Now, members, we need to adopt the DE3 amendment as amended before we take public testimony. Any questions? All in favor of adopting the DE3 amendment as amended, multiple, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say nay. Motion carries. Representative Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wasn't quick enough on the uptake. I just want to be clear of the direction. So we have the D, we're talking about it here, and then we finish it up next Tuesday. Is that kind of what we're doing? Or is this it? This is it?
This is it, Representative Miller. We're
Okay.
not voting it out of committee today.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
And then the next time we meet might be for a bus tour. So. All right, well, thank you, committee, for that. And with that, we'll open up public testimony. Do we have a list on it? Okay, good. So first up is Major General John Jensen, Adjutant General. General Jensen, welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the record and proceed.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Major General John Jensen, the 31st Adjutant General of Minnesota National Guard. Mr. Chair and committee members, thank you for the opportunity again today to come in and talk about the Minnesota National Guard. Specifically today, I'd like to talk about House File 2086. Mr. Chair and committee members, I'm disappointed at your budget proposal in the delete everything amendment to the House File 2086, as it does not appear to value our request for funding to support reintegration activities for our service members and their families. The amendment cuts our request by $400,000 and 78% reduction in the requested amount. Minnesota is known nationally as a leader in the reintegration of our service members returning from deployment. Walking back our support to our service members and their families does not show them the support they deserve and sends the wrong message to those states who look to Minnesota for leadership when it comes to service to our service members. I do appreciate that you spared most of the requested increase in the enlisted incentives appropriation. I deeply appreciate that. Our agency, the Department of Military Affairs and the Minnesota National Guard, prides itself in our stewardship of state and federal resources. Our requests are fact-based and not extravagant by any means. I do not expect a true budget cut to our agency in a year with a projected budget surplus. Our service members are committed to operations around the world at an increasing rate, with over 650 soldiers and airmen currently deployed, over 200 recently returned, and over 1,500 more preparing for deployment next year. I urge you to reconsider funding our requests at the amounts submitted. Help me demonstrate to our service members and their families that the state of Minnesota puts people first. I would like to just give 2 or 3 quick caveats to that testimony, Mr. Chair. I've deployed 4 times in my career as a military member. 2 of the times I deployed when there was no such thing as reintegration, Yellow Ribbon Network, and I compare and contrast that experience to the latter 2 deployments where I came back to a program that was committed not only to my reintegration, but the reintegration of my family. And I do not want to go backwards. I do not want to go back to what I experienced in 2001 and 2004, and instead use the experiences that I had in 2007 and 2010 as the way that we treat our service members and our families. I'm reminded that this fund played a significant role in 2012 when our 1st Brigade Combat Team returned back from Kuwait with what we were concerned about with a 40% unemployed or underemployment rate for those soldiers returning back from Kuwait. Using this fund, we were able to forward deploy state assets, both private and public sector assets, into Kuwait and at the mobilization station to ensure that our soldiers returned back to a state that was prepared to receive them in new employment. And finally, Mr. Chair, last night I had a public event. I had the opportunity to meet with a member of the Bethel Synagogue. Bethel Synagogue routinely adopts one of our deployed units every year. And as we talked about the great work that they have done on behalf of the Minnesota National Guard, I described what we had coming forward, both this year, next year, and the year beyond that. And this gentleman responded to me with, well, sir, I guess our work isn't done then, is it? And that's what I'd like to leave with this committee. Our work is not done as it relates to reintegration of our soldiers, our airmen, and their families upon the completion of their deployment. With that, Mr. Chair, I'm open to any questions that you or the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, General Jensen. Representative Becker-Finn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm not sure if this is a question for Adjutant General or if someone else knows this, but I'm just wondering what the current funding amount is, and maybe historically what that amount has been. I mean, I understand it's less than had been requested, but I'm wondering if you have a little context for that.
Mr. Chair, Madam Representative, I'm going to bring up Don Kerr. He'll give you the specific, but as he comes up to the table, I'll tell you that we were given a $1.5 million appropriation, a one-time appropriation that we've utilized over the course of time to fund all of our reintegration events. And Mr. Kerr will give you the exact year that appropriation came.
Mr. Kerr, welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the record and proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Don Kerr, the Executive Director of the Department of Military Affairs, and the Adjutant General's right on. In 2008, we received a $1.5 million appropriation with carry-forward authority, and we've been spending roughly about $130,000 a year. We've had a couple of high years, a couple of lower years, but that runs in at about 131. And with the forecasted deployments that we've got upcoming, our Combat Aviation Brigade and Infantry Battalion in the next year, plus the reintegration of the 34th Division coming back now, our estimates are that we needed more money than that, and that's where the numbers came from in our request.
Representative Becker-Finn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just so I have this straight and so that, you know, the public has this straight. So the way we've been funding these programs, it's not been something that's been in the budget every single year. It was a one-time appropriation back 11 years ago, and that you've been pulling from those funds as time's gone on. Okay, so it was, and they're nodding. So I just trying to get clear on how we got into a situation like this, you know, because sometimes the way that what we find in every committee is the way things are shifted, and one time or another has impacts down the road. So just wanted to make that clear.
Mr. Chair, Madam Representative, just to answer the question in public, yes, that's exactly what you described is how the program was funded. What we have proposed to go forward is to put the reintegration funding then in the biennium so it can be funded, so we can project forward, so it's a more accurate use of our funding for this, instead of a large sum that's managed over the course of, in this case, 11 years, to the point where it's almost exhausted now.
Representative Becker-Finn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And it does look like this isn't a one-time funding in this budget. So we're on the right track as far as recognizing it's an ongoing thing that should be in the tails and should be something that we're looking at that way.
Mr. Chair, Madam Representative, yes, correct.
Thank you.
Representative Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just kind of want to make a statement here. I'll be brief, I promise. I've been introduced really through bonding last year is where I first saw military affairs come forward last year with a request. And I know you're only given a certain target and you can only work within that target, and I'm not asking for extravagant things, but I'd like to put just a few things into perspective if I can, again, just for public record. So thank you for the grace of giving me just a couple minutes here. You know, our soldiers, probably of the people that serve this state, they ask for the least and they give the most. And I think when the general said, and I thank you for your testimony on that, when he said our agency prides itself in our stewardship of state and federal resources, our requests are fact-based and not extravagant by any means. General, you've proven that to me. That's absolutely hitting it on the head. And when I just wrote down a couple things. I see some of the other agency requests, whether it be for the staffing that they need, or for sometimes you see improvement of facilities. I know I toured, to put in contrast, the one thing that was stark to me is just after hearing about this bonding, I went and toured the Minnesota Sex Offender Program down in St. Peter. And the only thing that could keep going through my mind is I hope our soldiers have this good of facilities that they have down here. And I just want to make sure that as a state, I know it's an emotional thing driven. We certainly want to take care of our soldiers, and we usually do pretty good as a state. But if we aren't taking care of the most highly trained people that are willing to defend us with their lives, then we're missing the point. And so I certainly encourage the majority as we move forward to make sure that we keep a priority of the soldiers that are taking care of us, that we take care of them as well. I hear from the general that maybe we're kind of veering a little bit off from that, maybe a small step right now, but I certainly hope that we refocus and take care of those soldiers appropriately in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Miller. Representative Heinrich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen. General, you mentioned in support of reintegration assets being utilized in Kuwait. I was just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit more. What type of assets are brought there? Is it job training programs or something to that effect?
General Jensen.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Representative, yes, our first Armored Brigade combat team deployed to Kuwait in support of Operation New Dawn, 2011, 2012. About halfway through the deployment, the brigade commander, in a report back to the Adjutant General, reported that they were sensing serious stress amongst their soldiers as it related to returning back to Minnesota to jobs. His estimate at that time was 40% of the soldiers were either returning back as unemployed or severely underemployed. With support of DEED, with support of other institutions across the state, we were able to pay for non-military entities to go into Kuwait and meet with our soldiers and begin writing resumes, practicing job interview skills, items like that. Then we also sent another element down to their demobilization station to continue this process with the hope that we could give our soldiers the biggest step forward possible once they returned back to Minnesota. And what was initially described as a crisis of possibly 40% of our soldiers unemployed or severely underemployed. What we were able to do is very quickly, within 4 months, is reduce that rate to actually be lower than what the state unemployment rate was within 60 days of our soldiers returning. So that was a combination of great support from our state government, great support from academic institutions across the state, private employers as well, donated employee time for their human resource personnel to go forward into Kuwait and in the mobilization station to give our soldiers the biggest advantage that they possibly could have upon returning. That's one example of what we've used this $1.5 million appropriation that we received back in 2008 for.
Mr. Chair, thank you, General.
Representative Detmer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And this could be a possible solution to this situation. And when we're moving forward, the committee may want to consider the governor's recommendation to realign the veterans' homes medical service providers and use those savings, which is about $1 million, to fund General Jensen's reintegration funding program. I know the governor had, I think you have it on your spreadsheet here, the governor is looking at maybe contracting for a couple of the veterans' homes, the services at the veterans' homes, and that would be a savings, and maybe we could work some funds out that way.
Thank you for the, well, first off, I'll let the testifiers comment if they have anything on that.
Mr. Chair, committee members, I sincerely appreciate the hard work and the hard decisions that have to go into to a budget. I really do. Managing my own budget and making those decisions myself, I understand that. I don't think that I'm qualified to make a recommendation on the proposal on that. I mean, I'm really not. And so I would defer commenting any more than I'm not qualified to comment. Thank you.
Thank you, General. I thought I'd give you your chance anyways. Representative Detmer.
And Mr. Chair, I know this bill is not set in stone yet, and we still are taking a look at, there would be some wiggle room left and right or whatever, but hopefully we can work something out. So, thank you.
Thank you, Representative Detmer. We'll take that under advisement. That's certainly a good thought. Representative Becker-Finn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and just trying to get my head around where all these numbers go and where they come from. I'm wondering if maybe Ms. Roberts would be the one to answer this question. Just wondering if you can speak to the overall appropriation. Is it the same as, for instance, the last biennium? What difference are we at overall for military affairs?
Mr. Chair and members, if you look actually on the detailed spreadsheet on the second page, at the bottom, you'll see the grand totals for Department of Military Affairs, and there is a column, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in from the right margin that shows the difference from base, if that's your question. So you would see that that's $1.866 million increase over the base, and the base is what is established in the February forecast. It's the fiscal year 19 appropriation carried forward.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Kurt.
I would like to clarify, agreed with Ms. Roberts' numbers, but going back to the appropriation that was actually put out in the Laws of Minnesota 2017 First Special Session, Senate File 1, the amount appropriated to the agency was $47,756,000. The amount proposed in the current DE3 is $47,744,000, and that's a $12,000 reduction from the current biennium.
Thank you, Mr. Kurt. Representative Grossel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, sir, for bringing this forward. And thank you also for being good stewards. And that's something that we, as veterans, we as family members of veterans, we try to do, is continue to be good stewards. Make sure we put the funds that we have available to us in the best places where we're going to have the best results and have the best effect, especially on our soldiers. You know, we've heard bills in different committees. We've heard bills here that talk about domestic assault. We talk about suicide among veterans. We talk about being involved in the criminal justice system in crimes where we're trying to help them. But these are all bills. These are all things that are after the fact. These are things that are excuse me. These are all things that we're helping our veterans with after. And we all know we got to get on the front side of this. We all know that these veterans need that help before they come home. We all talk about it. So now we have an opportunity where let's do something about it. Mr. Chair, I know the guidelines that you've been given. I know the constraints that you're under. But instead of us just talking about this is a good thing, this is a needed thing, I ask you to beg, borrow, or steal. Meet this need, meet this request. And anything that everybody here on this committee can do to help, we'll do. But again, I just want to drive home, we've got to get on the front side of this. Because these are our sons and daughters. These are moms and dads that are coming home. They need our help before they come home. Not after the fact, not after a domestic assault, not after a crime committed. They need it before. So I just thank you again, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Grossel. Any other, Representative Heinrich?
Yeah, one more, Mr. Chair, thank you. You mentioned a $1.5 million appropriation back in 2008, and that fund is running low now. Can you give us an idea of what still exists in that fund?
Mr. Chair, Representative Heinrich, we will expend those funds before, probably by the end of this month. We have a couple of reintegration family prep academies and and events that are scheduled here in April and May. And we expect to run that down to zero or very near it this month.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So Mr. Kerr, from the chair's point of view on this, could I see a report on what are you doing as far as the reintegration aspects are going forward as we consider Representative Detmer's and other people's requests on this?
Mr. Chair, absolutely.
Thank you. Any other questions for the testifiers? Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for coming today.
Mr. Chair and committee members, thank you again for your time, your consideration, and your leadership. Thank you very much.
Next up, we have Brock Hunter from the Veterans Defense Project. Mr. Hunter, please state your name for the record and proceed.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, my name is Brock Hunter. I'm here representing the Veterans Defense Project today. I wanted to thank the chair and members of the committee for including House File 998, the Veterans Restorative Justice Act, as well as House File 430, the Veterans Justice Grant, in this Veterans Omnibus bill. I'd also like to thank you all on behalf of Minnesota's justice-involved veterans. And I want to emphasize that the Veterans Restorative Justice Act is a groundbreaking bill. This bill, if passed, will serve as a national model. It represents unprecedented cooperation and collaboration among prosecutors, defense attorneys, and other criminal justice stakeholders. And it is being watched across the country. In fact, we are just hearing that stakeholders in the state of Virginia are moving to introduce the Veterans Restorative Justice Act essentially verbatim as it exists here in Minnesota's legislature, in their own legislature moving forward. So it is already having an impact, and I think will be saving lives of veterans across the country if we're able to pass it and use it as a national model. With respect to the Veterans Justice Grant appropriation, we also thank Representative Zhang for being our chief author and other members of the committee as authors. This grant will help ensure the Veterans Restorative Justice Act is implemented across our state as intended, that our criminal courts understand the issues that bring our veterans into the criminal justice system, understand the resources that are available to help them, and understand how to implement and use the Veterans Restorative Justice Act to achieve its intended purpose. Together, we can all work together to ensure that our justice-involved veterans are returned to assets rather than ongoing liabilities to their communities, and that this time around we leave no veteran behind in the criminal justice system. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hunter. Any questions for Mr. Hunter from the committee? Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Is there anybody from the public that would like to testify for or against House File 2086? Come on up. Welcome to the committee, sir. Please state your name for the record and proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the council committee. My name is Andrew Peters. I'm a U.S. Army Vietnam era veteran who also continues his veteran commitment to our nation, serving as the American Legion as adjutant of Lake City Post 110, commander of Wabasha County, and for District 1 of the Legion, I am their legislative chair as well as vice commander of Area 1. I'm very appreciative that you allow me to speak on House File 2086. I'm not going to address the entire budget because I'm sure there's probably thousands of hours that's already been committed to it, and I don't think we need to reiterate. What I am going to address is in the section of Department of Veterans Affairs, specifically claims and outreach line item number 90, Honor Guard funding. As a member of the American Legion and a member of the Lake City Luce McHale Post 110 VFW 8729 Joint Honor Guard team, our Honor Guard units are appreciative of any funding that we can get to offset some of our costs associated performing ceremonial duties for veterans in cemetery ceremonies and other civic ceremonies that's asked of us. I would like to share some background information on activities performing these ceremonies from American Legion Post perspective. As an Honor Guard unit, we typically spend monies in our uniforms, which costs each of us about $400 each. mileage to and from the sites, costs associated with maintaining and firing weapons. Our squad is minimum of 7 members. Ideally, for full military honors, we'd like to have at least 13 members. Our funds to support this comes from our fundraising activities, gambling bar accounts, et cetera, which takes away monies from our community youth programs such as American Legion Baseball, Boy State School Safety Patrol. I would like to take a look at your $200,000 requested funding. In the American Legion, the state of Minnesota, I counted, I was surprised, we have 571 Legion posts. I did not look at the VFW, the Legion Riders, and the other federally chartered organizations that provide honor guard services. Our post, Lake City Post, we average about 45 ceremonies a year. Taking your $200,000 per annum by our 571 posts equates to $350 per post per year, or $8 an event. And for a squad of 17, that means we are allowed 50 cents per person. And if you ever go to a restaurant or a gas station, 50 cents doesn't take you very far. It costs us about $50 an event that we have to absorb. For sake of my preparation, I originally prepared my remarks for your companion bill on the Senate side, and when I saw this opportunity, and I'm very appreciative, I use $25 per event, or for each post, $1,125. Based on this and the number of Legion units, I feel the budget should go from $200,000 a year to $642,375. That covers part of our costs. But I'm going to use another alternative idea, and some of you may have heard me testify to other bills and other committees. I'm a strong believer federally chartered veterans organizations should not be taxed. The Senate side, I sat in a Senate committee meeting a couple of years ago, a state senator said, we purposely made federally chartered veterans organizations the most heaviest taxed nonprofit organization because we can do a good job collecting taxes for the state of Minnesota. I took personal offense into that. My retort to him was, fire your state and county assessors and put us in, we'll do it for free at a cost savings. But with that, obviously, we'll accept the $200,000. Option A, raise it to $642,000, or option C, make us totally exempt from all taxes, all fees, so we can retain what we bring in donations, so we can continue to support our community, our youth, our veterans, and specifically performing honor guard duties. It is an honor when we get called on to perform. We travel 2 hours to go to Preston on a moment's notice to provide ceremonies for the veterans interned at the Preston State Mill Cemetery, and it is a great honor to go to those hallowed, dedicated grounds. With that, I thank you for allowing me to share some ideas and hopefully cause some additional investigation. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts. Any questions for Mr. Roberts?
Peters.
I have one, Mr. Roberts.
Andrew Peters.
Oh, I'm sorry, Peters. Okay. I'm looking at my cheat sheet, Mr. Peters. I apologize. Ms. Roberts, is the fund, what's the status of this fund that Mr. Peters is talking about?
Mr. Chair and members, if you'll look on page 3 of the bill, you can see there's a rider that specifies the amount that we're discussing, the $200,000 per year. So that is specifically set aside in the funding for the Department of Veterans Affairs for that item, and that is the same level of funding that it's been in previous years.
Okay, and Ms. Roberts, is there a balance to that fund right now?
Mr. Chair, I'm not sure, it's a direct appropriation, so at the end of the biennium, if there was any money left, it would cancel to the general fund.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Peters. Sorry about mixing the names up. Any other questions for Mr. Peters? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Anybody else from the audience care to testify for or against this bill? Well, thank you. So with that, I'll renew my motion that House File 2086 as amended. What's that? Oh, okay. With that, Chair removes his motion that House File 2086 as amended be re-referred to Ways and Means. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carried. With that, path forward is going to go to Ways and Means. We will take a look at Representative Detmer's suggestion, see what we can do there, and I think it's a good one. Thank you for offering that. We will not, this is probably the last official meeting of the Veterans Committee this session, but Owen and I are going to take a look at figuring out how to do a bus trip later on and get us out of here for a couple hours and maybe see the Minneapolis Veterans Home and the Hastings Home. And with that, we are adjourned.